Hello and welcome again to the Writer Review. This is Eric Corrupt Writer, and this week we're going to be taking a look back at the 1990 gangster drama titled Goodfellas. Now, Goodfellas runs for 2 hours and 25 minutes long. It is directed by Martin Scorsese. It is produced by Irwin Winkler. The script was done by Martin Scorsese and Nicholas Pileggi. It is based on the book Wise Guy by Nicholas Pileggi. The score was done by Martin Scorsese, the cinematography by Michael Balhus, and the editing was done by Thelma Schoonmaker. And the stars of the movie are Ray Liotta as Henry Hill, Robert De Niro as Jimmy the Gent Conway, Joe Pesci as Tommy DeVito. He went on to win an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. Lorraine Bracco, she was nominated for Best Supporting Actress for her role as Henry Hill's wife, Karen Friedman Hill, and Paul Sorvino as mob boss Paulie Cicero. And of course, there's many other characters there too. Some of them are well known. There were some cameo appearances or small roles there. Samuel L. Jackson is actually in this. He has a small role as Stax Edwards. We also have Michael Imperioli, who became a big star on The Sopranos. He was in there. This is like one of his earlier roles. And Frank Vincent is also in there too. He plays the character role of the antagonistic Billy Bats, who is from a rival mafia family called the Gambinos. So, there's plenty of characters in this movie. So many. If I left any of them out, I'm sorry. So, what did I think of this movie? And so, from the opening narrative, from Henry Hill's thoughts, he has always had the dream and ambition to become a gangster, claiming that it was far better than the President of the United States. This was the beginning of a long line of intriguing narratives of Martin Scorsese's brilliant character study of mafia life in his 1990 magnus opus titled Goodfellas. Based on actual events, we follow Italian-Irish kid Henry Hill from his humble beginnings when he became ignited into the Italian crime family, the Lucchese's, as we see him work his way through heists and his in and out prison sentences to his drug trafficking empire. While this is happening, Henry's life and relationships are becoming far more complicated for him to handle, and he had to decide on whether, and in the end, he had to decide on whether he wants to face death from the mob or to take his seat in the witness protection program after he got arrested on account of narcotics. So, which eventually led to him going to court where he had to rat towards the people who have practically who had practically been his mentors. Especially I'm talking about Paulie Cicero, played by Paul Sorvino, and Jimmy the Gent Conway, played by Robert De Niro. He had to eventually rat on them in court, which could have put him in his life in jeopardy. But fortunately, that was not the case. So instead of working against the FBI, he had to end up spending almost the rest of his life working for the FBI. Behind all these enthralling events, Scorsese manages to add a myriad of colorful characters, which has become a benchmark of his. And of course, because of the R rating, it is also saturated in violence, humor, dedication, loyalty, and the ultimate price to pay: betrayal. The other notable performances comes from Robert De Niro as decorated criminal mind Jimmy the Gent Conway, and Joe Pesci as the diminutive but equally short-tempered assassin Tommy DeVito, who seems to be branded by a cornucopia of psychological disorders. I mean, practically Joe Pesci stole the movie. Let's face it. I mean, he was actually more fun to watch than Henry Hill at times. I mean, even though the movie is not necessarily gratuitously violent, it's more dialogue driven than anything. The body count is only five. Four of the people who died on screen was done by uh, Joe Pesci's Tommy DeVito. I mean, in front of us, we watched as Billy Bats gets the shit beaten out of him till finally, Tommy, Jimmy, and Henry just finish him off. And then you have Tommy DeVito killing off Spider, played by Michael Imperioli. There's a few small supporting performances in this movie as well. Imperioli was one of them. You know, he would later emerge on the TV show The Sopranos, playing a more prominent role later on in his career. This is early stuff for Imperioli. Stax Edwards, he gets whacked off for uh, double crossing during the infamous uh, Lufthansa heist, which was probably one of the biggest criminal heists in American history back in the 70s. The movie doesn't focus on it, but they do aforemention this in this movie. Of course, the other one is Maury Kessler. You know, the guy who ran a wig store, was also like an accomplice to the mafia. And eventually, Tommy DeSimone's or Tommy DeVito's death is also seen on screen. There's other deaths, but they're not like on the screen. You know, like in the pink Cadillac, you see Johnny Roast Beef and his wife lying dead. Frenchie and some other accomplice was in a garbage dumpster. And then you see Frankie Corbone have his body found in a meat freezer. So, you know, these are just some of the many casualties you see in the movie. But, you know, it's not graphically violent. Sure, there's a lot of swearing. That's probably where the strong R rate comes from. There is, I mean, there was supposed to be like 70 bombs, F bombs, but in this movie, the F bombs actually grossed out to about 240. And most of it, of course, comes from Joe Pesci's character, Tommy DeVito. I mean, and then, you know, DeVito actually did truly deserved his Oscar win because he was just fun to watch. He could be funny. He could be sick, but most of all, he could be violent. And that's just how Pesci played off this character. DeVito combines both the catalyst to both the gratuitous violence in the movie as well as most of the dark humor as well. And nobody combines both dark humor and violence better than Scorsese. He can dish that out with his eyes closed. Who could forget the memorable "What's so funny about me" scene, which has a preceding story that is filled with sharp humor that follows later with very intense dialogue, only to be followed by some friendly humor, which leads to unexpected violence. It's classic scenes like these that make this movie so unpredictable and yet very poetic in delivery. With a if there's any weakness into this movie, with a cesspool of talented performers, you could easily get lost in the shuffle. And that's exactly what happens to Ray Liotta in this movie. I'm not saying he was terrible in his leading performance here as gangster wannabe Henry Hill. He was excellent. But the fact of the matter is that there were a lot more veteran, established performers in this movie that he eventually got lost in the shuffle. With the major characters starring here, he was also the lesser convincing compared to his co-stars. His narration lacked in the integrity of a cold-blooded gangster, but more like a literature student contemplating his master's thesis on gangsterism in New York. Sometimes that's what he kind of sounded at times, which is not a bad thing, but it just did not have that convincing appeal. I mean, if you look at Casino, there's a lot of narrative, especially from returning actors in another Scorsese Nicholas Pileggi adaptation, Casino, where of course Robert De Niro was Sam Rothstein and Joe Pesci was Nicky Santoro. They had some pretty good, convincing narration, and I'm not saying that Ray Liotta didn't do bad, but I still think that his narration was not entirely convincing. The weight practically carries in this film on the performances of both Robert De Niro and Joe Pesci as they embody the emotions and the intrigue, which makes the film very believable and at the same time rich in very specific detail. Their respected roles are the reasons to watch this movie because they're more fun to watch than Henry Hill, who at times felt more like an observer as opposed to being part of the action like what De Niro and Pesci do. But with the characters and the dynamics within them are very satisfying, and Sir Liotta was great in his role, and his narration does embody a man who seems to be feared of what he got himself into and how to get out of it, if there's a way to get out of it without being dead. We could feel that. We feel his sympathy. We feel him at times. And yet the guy does not come across as being entirely likable. But then again, hey, look, you're a gangster, so chances are you're not going to do things that are going to embody flattery here. But at least we think he's a good kid. He's likable. He's just a very, very confused individual who needs to sort of reevaluate what he has got himself into and what he can do to get himself out of it without having to bite a bullet. And believe me, being a gangster is all about life or death. Because they don't come running to the cops. Uh-uh. When they want to take care of business, they do it personally. And their way of personal vengeance, well, it's all about do or die. So rounding out the supporting cast, I thought the chemistry between Ray Liotta and Lorraine Bracco as Henry's Jewish wife, Karen Friedman Hill, was really special. The trials and tribulations of this dysfunctional married couple added great depth to the story and was an important part in the film. And I thought that Lorraine Bracco's role as Karen Hill, she also was pretty good, and she did some narration in this film, and she wasn't just the stereotypical caught in the middle of all this stuff happening. She was always there for Henry. It's always good to stay by her. It's always good to stay by the person who you marry. That's all fine and dandy. But she knew that, this guy is not a legitimate individual. He's working for the mob. She's a mob wife. And she remains loyal to him because, hey, he has her kids. She knows it, and he knows it. And that's something she can't really seem to escape from. Although, it's been read somewhere that, like after this movie, they did divorce in 1990. The real Henry Hill and the real Karen Hill. but I won't really go too much into that. If I'm gonna do a review on the crime gangster families in New York, I'll do that like on another topic. For now, let's just stick to Goodfellas and what I had observed while watching this movie. It shows that unlike other gangster films, there is family life, sort of almost like The Godfather 2, provided there, and it steps out of the inner cycle of gangster films, which makes it all the reason you can't miss out on a film like this one. However, unlike Francis Ford Coppola, whose Godfather movies was used more to glorify the mafia lifestyle, Scorsese took his direction out in the mean streets of Brooklyn and makes the disjointed relationship between Henry and Karen all the more realistic. They're not living in, a fancy, immaculate, rich home. No. They're still kind of working class. That's because they say even in real life, the real Henry Hill used to waste a lot of his money and his earnings on gambling, drugs, and alcohol. So, they often said rumors that, even though he was making a lot, he was also losing a lot during his time with the mafia. Scorsese took his direction out in the mean streets of Brooklyn and makes the disjointed relationship between Henry and Karen all the more realistic. Scorsese also once said that all good films are there to teach us the lesson of life. Well, Goodfellas gives us a hard lesson about respect, dedication, betrayal, assets, and liabilities. So when it's all said and done, Goodfellas stands strong in terms of performances, cinematography, direction, and writing. This movie is probably the greatest gangster film in cinema history. Even though it has some flaws, the movie does a great job in not only looking at the dark side of gangster life, but it demonstrates how good storytelling operates. A fine example of Scorsese's direction can easily be summed up near the scene where Henry and Karen enter into the Copacabana and they go through the halls. They go past the club and past the kitchen and into a dining area where they are being seated at a table with waiters to serve them. I can't recommend this film enough. It's a wonderful movie, not just for gangster fans, but for people who appreciate good cinema. If I was to give this movie a scale out of 10, I would give it a 9.5. So I guess this ends my writer review. Thank you all for listening, and if you want to subscribe to my channel, please feel free to do so. If you want to leave a comment, go right ahead. Remember, be kind, be courteous, don't be rude, and I will be back again with another movie review. So until next time, this is Eric Ryder saying, keep watching those movies, and I'll see you around. Goodbye.